Shalom everyone, Shabbat again, and again a new reading of the Torah, and we have a new book. Last week we finished the book of Numbers, and this week we're starting a new book, the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy is very unique, very special book, different than any other book. First of all, the name itself. In Hebrew we call it Dvarim because that's the first words of the Hebrew text of the book of Deuteronomy. In chapter 1 verse 1 it says, Ele Advarim, these are the words which God has spoke to. No, I'm wrong. Not which God has spoke, which Moses had spoke to the children of Israel. They had encamped on the Jordan River. Moses is about to go up Mount Nebo and never come down, essentially die in Mount Nebo, and he's addressing the whole nation. If you read the text in Hebrew, which is normally shorter than in English, you are going to be able to read it in about 3 hours. If you read straight the book of Deuteronomy, 3 hours. Moses probably spoke faster than most Israelis speak today, may have finished it in 2.5 hours. They were not sitting in easy chairs or pews, church pews. They were standing up, facing Jericho on the other side of the Jordan River. Hot, no air conditioning. And Moses is addressing the people. And the name in Greek is Deuteronomos, which means the second law, or the second giving of the law, of the Torah. What does it mean, the second giving of the Torah? Well, the first giving of the Torah was in Mount Sinai. We have the record of it from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And this is now the second giving of the Torah, which is very interesting. In other words, it's a renewal of the covenant. Renewal of the covenant means that now Moses is not only retelling the story of what happened in the wilderness and the exodus from Egypt and all the highs and lows of the relationship between him and Israel and God and Israel. And this retelling of the story is quite interesting. In the first place, this is the only book in the Bible, in the Old Testament, other than in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, that says that if you add anything or you subtract anything from the words of this book, you will have to deal with God. You'll be doing a big sin. And it's forbidden to add or detract from the text of this book. However, when we read the book of Deuteronomy, we find out very quickly that nothing in the book of Deuteronomy is even similar to the text of the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. First of all, there's a lot of new laws that we didn't know about in the other books of the Torah. For example, circumcision of the heart, that appears here in chapter 10 and again at the end of the book in chapter 30, is something that doesn't appear at all in the other books of the Torah. No mention of it. The other mention of it is in Jeremiah. Jeremiah probably is quoting from the book of Deuteronomy. The other place that it's mentioned in the Bible is in the New Testament in Paul's letters and in the book of Hebrews. Okay, here is one thing that is different. But if we examine even the Ten Commandments in chapter 5, they're not the same Ten Commandments as they are in the book of Exodus chapter 20. There, God is speaking from the mountain. Children of Israel are encamped around the mountain, and they are hearing the voice of God, not the voice of Moses. And now Moses is retelling the Ten Commandments in chapter 5. And if you compare the text, you see that there is quite a bit differences, especially on the laws of the Shabbat. The Shabbat laws are different. And in one place it says, remember the Sabbath day, like in this text. And in the other it says, keep the Sabbath day. Between keeping and remembering, big difference. But not only that, also the reason why we should keep the Sabbath day is different. And in fact, every law in the book of Deuteronomy is different than every law in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. For example, in book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, only the children of Aaron and their descendants are Kohanim, are priests. The Levites have a different task, the priests have a different task. In the book of Deuteronomy, every Levite gets a turn to be a priest. Now, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Israelites can build an altar anywhere in the land. There was Joshua built an altar up on Mount Ebal. I had the privilege of visiting that altar before the Arabs destroyed it. It was way up on Mount Ebal. I went with military escort. I went with a jeep in front and a jeep behind, and the altar was still intact, almost completely intact. Now it doesn't exist. But it was not in Jerusalem, not in one place. It was the Mount Ebal. Gideon lived in Ophrah. The judge Gideon lived in Ophrah. He built an altar in Ophrah. Samuel had an altar in Ramah. And then he crowned Saul the first time in Ramah. And then in Mizpah, he had built another altar. The children, some of the tribes came to Mizpah and they crowned King Saul. The second time in Mizpah, and then that wasn't enough. They took him down to the Gilgal and they built another altar in the Gilgal, and they had another offering at the Gilgal and crowned him a third time. Elijah had an altar on Mount Carmel. The fire came down, devoured the sacrifice in front of the prophets of Baal in the end of the first book of Kings. So there were altars all over, there were Levites all over. They were offering sacrifices left and right, up and down, whenever they wanted to, without any restriction. There was a Levite in every village, and in every village they offered sacrifices. In the book of Deuteronomy, there is a centralization of worship in one place, only in one place, only in Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem is not mentioned. Why is Jerusalem not mentioned? Is because the report of the book of Deuteronomy that it was given by Moses at the entrance of the children of Israel to the land of Canaan. Moses didn't cross the Jordan, but immediately after this book of Deuteronomy, the children of Israel with Joshua crossed the Jordan, coming to the land of Canaan. Jerusalem was not in their hands yet. That's why they couldn't be. But it says, in the place in which I will show you, that's the only place that you can offer sacrifices. Yep. Totally different. There was Shiloh, the tabernacle. The tabernacle moved to Nebo. Not to Nebo, excuse me. To Nob, N-O-B. To Nob, which is today's Mount Scopus, where the Hebrew University is located today. One of the campuses of the Hebrew University. On Mount Scopus, that's ancient Nob. That's where King David went to the priest and lied to the priest and took the bread that was baked on the Sabbath for the Lord, and took the sword of Goliath and lied about the fact that King Saul sent him to take the sword of Goliath. We have all kinds of very interesting stories. But the book of Deuteronomy reflects a different reality. The reality of the book of Deuteronomy comes into play, comes into being only at the great religious reform of King Josiah. The story is that the priest found this book in the temple, a book that was not known by them before that, and then they made a big reform and destroyed all the high places, all the altars all around the land, and centralized the worship in Jerusalem. Josiah, a couple of kings before they went out to exile in Babylon. Yep. Deuteronomy is very different, very special. And there is very different laws. For example, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, there is no mention of ever having a king in Israel. In the book of Deuteronomy, you find out that there is specific laws given of how the king is supposed to behave and how the people are supposed to behave toward the king. It's very special. Samuel quotes a lot of these laws in chapter 9 of Samuel, when the children of Israel come to him and say, we want a king of flesh and blood. He knows the laws, and he quotes them almost exactly as they are in the book of Deuteronomy. These things make the book of Deuteronomy very, very important. But the most important thing about the book of Deuteronomy that I want to discuss with you today, this is short and we don't have the time to actually go through the book of Deuteronomy, and not even through this portion of the first portion of the Torah reading that was read today in our synagogue and in every other synagogue. And we don't have time to go verse by verse or point by point, but I have to touch on a couple of things before I summarize the importance of this book and our study in this book, which will continue for the next 8 weeks till we come to Sukkot and we end the book of Deuteronomy and go back to the beginning to read from the book of Genesis again. One more year it goes by. So, here you are now. I'm going to go to the book of Deuteronomy, and go to chapter 3. Moses is retelling the story of what happened in the wilderness. According to Moses, the children of Israel came to him and said, send spies to the land and spy out the land, and so that we can have security, so that we know what we're going into and what is expected of us. So Moses sent the spy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, in our portion, he says that the people of Israel asked him to, the leadership of Israel asked him to send the spies. But if you go back to chapter 12 of the book of Numbers, chapter 11 of the book of Numbers, the children of Israel are not the ones who are telling him. God is commanding him. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, choose yourself men and send them. There is almost in every story in the book of Deuteronomy that is retelling of the story, there is a slight difference between how it is understood from the earlier books to the book of Deuteronomy. What's the importance for us as believers in Yeshua who believe that the New Testament, the New Covenant, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, and the letters of the apostles, and the book of Revelation are inspired as the Torah and the prophets. And we have differences in the New Testament from the Torah and the prophets, things that are new to us, that we didn't know before. And here is the thing. God gave the law. God gave the Torah, and it's His Torah. It's my Torah. It's my instruction, God says, in the prophets and in the Torah itself. What means that if God gave it, it's His, and if it's His, He can change it. Who said that God can't change it? Moses says, you can't change it, but God can change it. Here you are. The second giving of the law, the book of Deuteronomy, is a change, a major change from Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The Torah was given in Mount Sinai. You have the record in Exodus chapter 20. Now Moses is in the foot of Mount Nebo on the shore of the Jordan River in front of Jericho, and he is changing almost all the laws. And he's doing it by God. Later on, the prophets continued that same attitude. Jeremiah, just before he announces that God is going to make a new covenant with Israel and with Judah, in chapter 31, verse 31, in verse 29 and verse 20 of the same chapter, just 2 verses in front, is changing things. God's changing the covenant. He said, no longer will it be said that the fathers have sinned and the children's teeth are going to stand on edge. Each one who sins, his own teeth will stand on edge. Ezekiel repeats that in chapter 18 of Ezekiel. No longer will there be the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the sons and upon the grandsons up to the 3rd and 4th generation, like in Exodus chapter 34. No longer. The prophet says that's not going to be any longer true. It's going to be a change. God can give a new covenant. And that new covenant is the last revelation of God. We know and we believe in progressive revelation. Moses knew more about God than Abraham. We know that from the book of Exodus chapter 6. It says, God says to Moses, I didn't reveal myself by my name, Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh, the Tetragrammaton, Jehovah. I didn't reveal by this name to the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't know anything about Jehovah. According to that verse in Exodus chapter 6. He said, I revealed myself to them only as God Almighty, El Shaddai. Now I'm revealing to you that my real identity is the Tetragrammaton, Jehovah, Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh. They didn't know that. According to Exodus 6, they didn't know that. Now, Moses knows about it. Progressive revelation. And what Moses knew was a lot more than what our forefathers knew. But what he knew was not as much as later generations that already settled the land and lived in the land and faced their enemy. God gave them new revelations, like the revelation in the book of Deuteronomy, that all the worship has to be centralized in one place, in Jerusalem. Yes. And then God told Jeremiah that he's going to give a new covenant, and it's not going to be exactly like the same covenant that he gave the children of Israel when he took them by his hand out of the land of Egypt. One of the major differences will be where the covenant will be written. The covenant of Sinai was written on stone tablets, put inside a wooden box, the Ark of the Covenant. Jeremiah says that's not going to be any longer true. My law will be written in your hearts, in Jeremiah 31, chapter 31, from verse 31 to 34. My law will be written, my Torah will be written in your hearts, no longer on stone, no longer in a wooden box. And it will be different. It will be new. It will be something new. That doesn't mean that everything in it will be new, and it doesn't mean that you have to throw away everything that was old, because the ratification of the Torah, is by the new covenant. The new covenant doesn't come to throw away the old, it comes to build upon it and to, make changes and corrections to make the old law, which essentially failed. I mean, the children of Israel went to exile because they failed to keep the laws of God. And modern Judaism today has invented a new approach, which is called the oral Torah, which, as they used to say in the South, it's anybody dog that will go hunt with him, which means that any rabbi, any group of rabbis, any generation, the rabbis could have changed it, and they did change. They added laws, they added fences around the laws in order to protect people from falling into the sin that these laws brought. Yes, there were changes. God can change his laws, and the book of Deuteronomy is the best and the most major example of this, folks, which means that our authority today is from Genesis to Revelation. And we see the progression of God's revelation, and we understand very well that we today can't do what Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. You know, Abraham had mistresses, concubines, however you defined it and however you wanted. He was married to Sarah, and then he had a child from Hagar, and then we find out he had 6 other boys from Keturah, that was the handmaid of Sarah. Yep, you know, they're a different world. Today we're in a different world. We have a different matrix for what is right and wrong, what is God's will for us today. Yeah, I mean, just not too long ago, less than 100 years ago. I mean, I remember when the milkman came on a donkey, dragging a cart behind him, and that there was no frozen chicken and there was no supermarkets. You went to the market, you got a live chicken, you took it to the rabbi, you know, slaughtered the chicken, you brought it home, your mother plucked the chicken, then cooked the chicken, then, you know, cleaned up the chicken and used the gizzard for one thing, the liver, did different things with it, because that was the ancient world. Today we're in a different world. And if Judaism and the believers don't learn to adapt, not to ignore the text, but to adapt with the text to our modern lifestyle, to our modern machines, to our modern technologies, to our modern transportation, we die. Spiritually, we will die. Judaism will die if very soon the rabbis don't find a way to permit people to drive on Shabbat, at least to go to synagogue. Because most of the synagogues are not going to have a minyan. They're not going to have 10 men on Shabbat and in the holidays to be able to worship and say all the prayers that need a community in order to say them. Yes, Judaism has to adapt. The believers need to adapt. Not to ignore, I'm repeating this point, not to ignore the text, but to understand the text better and deal with the difficulties in light of the text. Yes, it can be done, it must be done, and the book of Deuteronomy is the best example how God, in the course of 38 years from the giving of the law in Mount Sinai, repeated and gave a new law to the children of Israel that is nothing like the old law that they had when they were encamped at the foot of Mount Sinai. Our faith in Yeshua, our faith in the Gospels, and in the book of Acts, and in the letter of the apostles, and in the book of Revelation is as relevant as Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then the words of the prophets that renewed many things and changed many things. And it's as relevant, more relevant to us today, the Gospels of the New Testament and the letters of the apostles and the book of Acts and the book of Revelation are the last revelation of God, and the last revelation of God is always the most important and authoritative for us, because we can look back and see how the Torah is exemplified and is materialized in Yeshua, in the teachings of Yeshua that are all based on the Torah and the prophets and on the teaching of the apostles. Yes, studying the book of Deuteronomy is that important, and it's very important for us to understand that God is giving us progressive revelation. The church of tomorrow may not look as the church of yesterday, but it may be closer to the first century church, community of the saints, like we read in the book of Acts. In order to go forward, we may need to go backwards and restore the attitudes and the freedoms and the broad-mindedness of Moses and of the apostles. So take the time, read today Deuteronomy 1 through 4, get the impression of what's going on, and enjoy the fellowship with the Word of God and with the one who gave the Word, God Himself and Yeshua, our Messiah. Have a good Shabbat and a good week. We'll continue another very, very important parasha next week. With Hanan, Moses is begging God, is pleading with God for himself and for the children of Israel. Anybody who's interested in intercession, into advocacy for his people and for the people of Israel, next week's portion is very important, and you can start reading it from chapter 5. It's the giving of the Ten Commandments there, and many other important things that we will do next week. May God bless you all, and Shabbat Shalom to all of you.